Thank you very much, Dr. Kofi. And let me also thank very much Catherine for the great job that you are doing. Thanks for the great and a very humbling introduction. And I'd also like to acknowledge, before I start, Madam Kagina, Alain Kagina, the Executive Director of the Uganda National Roads Authority, who I know. She is a partner of the African Development Bank, and we last saw each other, as you know, Alain, when I was in Uganda to receive honorary doctorate at the Makerere University. I also want to thank Dr. Muleko for being here, both of you as discussants of the lecture. And I want to start by apologizing to you that you actually do not have the copies of the lecture with you. I've been traveling so heavily, but I know that you will both do great justice to the discussion today. So thank you. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from around the world. It is a tremendous honor and joy for me to be with you today. I wish to express my sincere appreciation to Barrister Emeka Nwankpa. Brother Emeka Nwankpa is a leader. He is a mentor. And when I was growing up in the university in IFA, Nigeria, that he said is now Obafemi Awolowo University, he was actually the person who inspired my faith as a young Christian and helped to build a lot of those. And a lot of what I am today, I owe to God through the lot of teachings that he actually provided when we were at the university. So Brother Emeka, it's very, very good to see you, sir. I'd like to thank the board and leadership of the SALT Institute for inviting me to deliver this virtual public lecture on integrity, leadership, and stewardship for national transformation. Your mission to develop a new kind of African leadership training institute that will churn out tomorrow's global leaders today is highly remarkable. I'm speaking to you today from Berlin, where I have just attended the G20 Compact with Africa Summit with Chancellor Merkel and several African heads of state to discuss Africa's development. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the challenges of debt and insecurity in Africa, as well as globally, with the situation in Afghanistan, the need for focused, effective, and accountable leadership is crucial today more than ever before. I am therefore very pleased that we will be focused on the issues of leadership today. One of Africa's most critical needs today is for new leaders with new ideas to help create a new Africa, a transformed Africa. At every level of human endeavor, we need a new generation of highly skilled, competent, and visionary leaders with the characters to match, who have what it takes to steer the ship of organizations, institutions, and nations, especially in uncertain and challenging times. There is absolutely no doubt that we live in a world today where the need for such leaders has never been greater. Globally, we are confronted with enormous challenges of poverty, COVID-19 pandemic, climate crisis, rising insecurity, and unemployment, among others. Tackling them requires exceptional leadership, boldness, vision, and faith. Challenging times call for leaders with the capacity to inspire and capture the imaginations of those that they lead, and the creative ability to change the status quo for the better. In the process, they transform what once was in ways that otherwise will never have been possible. In short, good leaders can and do make a difference. That is why the arc of history shows that many times leaders emerge in challenging times and against all odds. With insight, foresight, vision, wisdom, and character, they change the destinies of people, institutions, societies, and nations. For us in Africa, we do not have to look far for examples. Now, after spending 23 lonely years incarcerated in jail, Nelson Mandela became the president of a free and democratic South Africa in 1994. Even then, the naysayers said he could not transition effectively from prison to the proverbial palace. Against great odds, he left his footprints so powerfully in the sands of time. From the ashes of war and one of the worst genocides in our generation, President Paul Kagame has transformed his beautiful nation, Rwanda, against all odds. Against great odds, my good friend and big sister, the former Liberian president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, steered our country away from the ravages of war. Her critics at the time said there was no occupancy in the presidency for a woman candidate. How wrong could they be? Against great odds, she proved the pundits wrong and continues to leave her footprints in the sands of time. For these and many other African leaders in the public and private sector, academia and research institutions, civil society, judiciary, legislative bodies, and communities of faith, the journey to the top is not always linear or easy. But like eagles, they have learned to soar high above the winds of turbulence. And from the vantage point of height and sight, they craft creative solutions that calm storms, change circumstances, and transform societies and nations. I believe there are many in our virtual conference today who have a date with destiny to become change and transformation agents in this generation. Just in case you are saying to yourself, I am not sure I am that person. Let me simply remind you of my favorite Bible hero, my biblical hero, Moses. In Exodus chapter 4, he was in dialogue with God. He informs the creator of the heavens and the earth that he is inadequate for the task for which he has been called. He also goes on to try and talk God out of the idea of appointing him to deliver the people of Israel out of the hands of Pharaoh. To all the protestations, God simply says, now what's in your hand? Moses responds, a staff. As far as Moses was concerned, what he held in his hand was a simple shepherd's staff. But not long after that, with the army of Pharaoh behind him and the deep sea in front of him, and the millions of Israelites he was leading, all seemed lost. That is, until the simple staff in his hand, under God's mighty power, became an instrument of deliverance. What at the time seemed to be insignificant object eventually was used to make a way where there seemed to be none. So let's reflect for a moment. What is that gift, skill, ability, competence, or relationship that you have in your hand today? Does it seem insignificant to you? Let me assure you, every good gift in your life has been placed there for a reason. I strongly believe that in this generation, you have been called to be a waymaker in your respective spheres of influence. And I remember when Brother Akinwunmi visited me in Abidjan, I remember telling him that in every single assignment that I have taken, I always tell myself, recognize, Akin, you are only an instrument of change in God's hands. The doer is God, but you are simply an instrument. May God make us to be effective instruments in his hands to change this world for good, because that's what God really wants it to be. I now turn to the theme of the keynote I've been asked to deliver, titled Integrity, Leadership, and Stewardship for National Transformation. Allow me to share a few thoughts on what distinguishes leaders, institutions, and nations that produce transformational changes. Number one, integrity. I'm glad to note that the first word in the title of the keynote is integrity, followed in that order by leadership, stewardship, and then national transformation. Integrity is described by the Oxford Dictionary as the quality of being honest, having strong moral uprightness. It is characterized by honesty, reliability, trustworthiness, patience, hard work, and responsibility. Therefore, when we say someone has integrity, we are saying effectively that the person embodies these important qualities. Likewise, the Latin root word for integrity, called integritas, connotes uprightness, truthfulness, authenticity, reliability, and consistency in word and action. It embodies being whole and not broken. Integrity has also been described as adhering to what one believes to be right, especially when the price is paid for foregoing immediate gain. Integrity primarily entails behaviors that seek the most moral outcomes, even when there is a cost to the leader for taking a principled stand. Several institutional and governance deficiencies have for long hindered the capacity of several African countries to build the level and density of productive activity required for economic transformation. To experience sustained economic growth and effective national transformation in today's highly complex society, Africa must strengthen its democratic institutions. Leaders must demonstrate integrity and fairness to all segments of society to prevent conflict and threats to national stability and cohesion, which in turn adversely affect economic growth. In some countries, political power often rests on proceeds from state capture, rents, and corruption that had for decades defied solutions, and which continues to generate persistent inequities. These vices are responsible for much of the continent's economic underperformance. Poor governance and corruption erode state capacities. It makes it impossible to provide adequate public services, and it creates a sense of exclusion among the diverse people represented in many countries on the continent. Change and transformation requires inspirational leadership and a zero tolerance for corruption, in whatever form it appears. Which is why those in leadership positions must be accountable by declaring their performance achievements annually and transparently accounting for expenditure. Furthermore, Supreme Audit institutions and auditors with integrity should verify such claims to ascertain their veracity. Unfortunately, there's a tendency to place transformation at the center of enterprise without the building blocks of integrity. The reality is that integrity undergirds leadership at every level of society and in every sphere. It is at the foundation of all that works and does not work. It sends a clear and resonant message that good ethics is the foundation of good governance. The absence of integrity is the equivalent of building castles in the sand. Without the foundational pillar of integrity, there can be no national or continental transformation. Anything else is simply illusion. Number two, vision. A second essential element is vision. With it, leaders shape every area of human endeavor. Visionary leaders intuitively have a sense of what the problems are long before they appear on the horizon. They then proactively and innovatively provide solutions that help bring the preferred future into the present with clearly mapped out strategies. 10 years ago, when I had the privilege of serving as Nigeria's Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, I had to come up with a vision to tackle myriad of challenges. And I can tell you, it was not an assignment that was easy. It was not an assignment for the faint at heart. The challenges were many. They included one of the worst floods in the history of Nigeria shortly after I took office, pushbacks from within and outside government, and demand for measures that I knew could not lift the bottom of the pyramid out of poverty. I had to contend with resistance to change from some segments of the private sector, not to talk of the grinding poverty and the lack of access to resources that had held millions of Nigerian farmers back for decades. As Minister of Agriculture, I was committed, as somebody who grew out of poverty myself, right from the beginning, to end decades of institutionalized corruption in the fertilizer sector. Now, many said it could not be done and that I will be stepping on some very influential toes. But my team and I were determined. For every single thing that I do in my life, it's always about Nehemiah, go and rebuild the broken walls and make things better for people. We worked literally day and night for 90 days and effectively took the government out of the business of fertilizers and handed this over to the manufacturing and private sector, where such activity rightly belonged in the first place, not with governments. But the bigger challenge was how to get resources of fertilizers, improved seedlings, and technologies to Nigerian farmers. The system was so corrupt that for over 40 years, only 11% of the fertilizers bought and sold by government ever got to farmers. And I remember when I took on this assignment, I told my darling wife, MEC Grace, and I said, honey, I'm going to, by God's grace, take on this challenge. If I can't do this, I should quit as minister. But by God's grace, we will take it on. The only thing I cannot guarantee you is whether I will come home alive. I turned to the power of mobile phones to create a total disruption of decades-old government-driven and government-controlled procurement and distribution of fertilizers and seeds. We developed and implemented an innovative electronic wallet system that directly provided farmers with direct digital cash payments for subsidized farm inputs at scale using their mobile phones. We cut out the bad guys, the middlemen. We brought in transparency and accountability. Farmers were empowered. The impact was dramatic. Over 15 million farmers received their subsidized fertilizers and seeds all through the innovation and vision of using electronic wallet system and the power of mobile phones. I remember when I visited one of the areas in northern Nigeria where we have insecurity, we had insecurity at the time. There were a number of women that were running to where I was. I was visiting one of the farms area, one of the irrigated perimeters. And they were all wearing black powder. And of course, because of the insecurity in the north, my security staff got scared and they wanted to rush me into the vehicle. And I said, please don't do that. I don't feel threatened. And we stayed. And as the women, they all came, they were all wearing black powder. All of a sudden, they put their hands in their pockets. They took out their mobile phones and they said, Minister, thank you very much for these mobile phones or this electronic wallet system. We women that are always marginalized, we get our seeds, we get our fertilizers right here in our villages. And they turned to the men and said, now the men can no longer cheat us. I felt so good. The power of revolution, the power of technology and innovation to transform the lives of people. The percentage of farmers who receive subsidies rose from 11%, that is, they got the inputs from 11% under the old government contract-based system, to 94% under the new electronic wallet system. This bold policy helped to increase food production in Nigeria by an additional 21 million metric tons of food. Such was the power of the vision. Today, the electronic wallet system for farmers has gone global and has been implemented in several African countries and as far away as Afghanistan. That was, of course, before Afghanistan blew up just about 2 weeks ago. In just 4 years, these and other innovations helped to radically change the perception of agriculture from subsistence to a viable business that attracted approximately $5.6 billion in private sector investments. Now let's turn the page a little bit. Similarly, when I arrived at the African Development Bank, when I was elected by God's grace 6 years ago, I developed and launched my vision for rapidly transforming Africa. I simply called it High Fives. Number one, light up and power Africa. Number two, feed Africa. Number three, industrialize Africa. Number four, integrate Africa. And number five, improve the quality of the life for the people of Africa. They were simple, but if well implemented, they will allow Africa to rapidly change its development trajectory. I am somebody totally impatient for Africa's development. At the time, several people jokingly asked if this high fives was simply a form of greeting. Everybody says "I." For them, the grand idea encapsulated in the vision was just too simple. But the job of leaders is to cast your vision in ways that are compelling, simple, easy to understand. Because I know when I read the Bible, it says that if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, who will prepare themselves for battle? The high fives are now achieving remarkable results and impacting the lives of Africans all over. An independent assessment by the United Nations Development Program showed that if these high fives were fully implemented, they will allow Africa to achieve 90% of Agenda 2063 of the African Union. They will also allow Africa to achieve at least 90% of the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, dear brothers, friends, ladies and gentlemen, 5 years down the line, the high fives have helped to impact directly on the lives of over 330 million people. My team and I then recognized that we will need more resources to have the kind of impact at greater scale that Africa needed. And to do this, I decided to ask our shareholders, countries, for a massive general capital increase for our bank. At the time, several well-meaning people told me that it could not be done. Someone even told me that the idea was simply dead on arrival. Others said, no, well, no first-time president of the African Development Bank has ever taken the risk of expending so much political capital with shareholders. If you believe in your vision, then fight for it. It was a risk I was willing to take. Finally, the risk paid off in 2019. When the shareholders, with the strong support of the board and the governors of the bank, approved a 125% increase in the authorized capital base of the bank, which raised the capital of the bank from $93 billion to $208 billion. Incredible. It was the largest general capital increase in the bank's almost 60-year history. So why do I share this with you? Very simply. Sometimes no is a response. and not necessarily an answer. In life, you will receive many no's, but that is not the final answer. I love the song that always says, God has the final say. Visionary leaders must therefore look for pathways to bring their ideas to fruition. It requires patience, humility, wisdom, diplomacy, strategic thinking, planning, teamwork, a tremendous amount of energy. Because if you don't have energy, people are not going to be able to follow what you're doing. You got to have passion. And of course, a great deal of faith in your ideas, in your teams, your colleagues, and of course, your trust in God. Today, based on a vision that was birthed in 2015, and through the tremendous support of many colleagues and partners, our board and the shareholders, the African Development Bank Group, which by the way is made up of several funds, including the African Development Fund and the Nigeria Trust Fund, has accelerated major investments and development across the continent. And that's why I was saying I was very pleased to have here with us today Mrs. Kagina, and she can speak about the work that we are doing together on building infrastructure all across Africa, where the bank has, in the last several years, invested well over $40 billion. And a number of those are transnational infrastructure, which I'm sure she can talk about in our intervention. Most of this infrastructure includes transportation and integrative technologies to the state-of-the-art highways. We have Kampala-Jinja Highway in Uganda, for example, roads and seaports, airports, and submarine IT infrastructure and backbones, which help to accelerate global and intra-African trade and the movement of people, goods, services, and of course, financial data. Together, this integrated infrastructure supports the goals and ambitions of the African Continental Free Trade Zone, which connects all the African countries together with a collective GDP of $3.3 trillion. That is the largest free trade zone in the world. And we support that, and of course the Secretariat is based there in Ghana, which the bank fully funded. While it may be challenging for some to see what is happening now, I can assure you that there are several ambitious policies and plans and projects and people, and I mean ambitious in a positive sense, who are already helping to shape the Africa that will emerge in the decades to come. We have a long way to get to where we need to be, but we will get there by the special grace of God. Number 3 issue I want to talk about, focus. Focus. Providing creative and visionary solutions goes beyond investment projects. It includes the greatest infrastructure of all, what I refer to as gray matter infrastructure, brain infrastructure. When Bill Gates and I were discussing the issue of malnutrition in Africa, and we were trying to get ministers of finance to get into it, and they were not getting it, I told Bill, I said, why don't we change that to gray matter infrastructure? I can repair a port, a rail, a dam, whatever, or even a power plant. But brain cells, once they are gone forever. So we must build gray matter infrastructure, recognizing the best infrastructure any society has is its human capital. In 2019, the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore was a guest of mine at the African Development Bank during our Eminent Speaker series. He said something that challenged me, and I continue to think about it every single day. He said that Singapore's rapid economic growth and development was because they considered their most important asset was their human capital. And that in fact, the most important position in the government of Singapore was not the Minister of Finance, was not the Minister of Industry. The most important position in Singapore is the Minister of Education. Wow. To have an idea of how Singapore prioritizes education, think of the following. It spent $12.8 billion on education in 2018 and almost $20 billion in 2020. Today, Singapore tops the rankings in global education. Its first-rate human capital powers an economy driven by high-tech industries, electronic manufacturing, including machineries and computers, medical equipment, shipping, and global financial services. The difference. The lesson is clear. Success does not happen by chance. And hope is not a strategy. Rather, hope needs action to win victories. Therefore, we must put our money where our mouth is and invest in our most precious asset, our young children and our vibrant youth. I was happy to hear Catherine speaking at the early part of this opening part of this conversation. To do that, we must strategically build a new leadership pipeline that places the younger generation at the center of our policy formation and development agendas. We have a responsibility to provide quality education and capacity building opportunities that prepare the younger generation for the jobs of the future, not the jobs of the past. In our fast-paced, digitally driven economy, our youth are playing catch-up with the rest of the world. It is our responsibility to ensure that graduates who enter this vastly new world of uncertainty and opportunity are well positioned. Today, over 13 million young Africans enter the labor market every year. But currently, there are only enough jobs to absorb a mere 3 million of them, which means that annually, Africa has a deficit of 10 million jobs per annum. If not addressed seriously and strategically, the social implications down the road are only best imagined. Doing so requires leadership that understands the challenges of the present, anticipates the problems of the future, of course, and its opportunities, and provides solutions now, in the now, and long before that future arrives. Organizations and nations that consign leadership to chance and to simply the older generation alone ultimately pay a very heavy price. That is why, given the accelerating speed of the fourth industrial revolution, the African Development Bank, along with the Rockefeller Foundation, Microsoft, and Facebook, invested in and launched what we call Coding for Employment Program. The Coding for Employment Program in Africa. Our goal, through more than 130 coding centers across Africa, is to reskill and redirect our labor force, provide hundreds of thousands of young men and women with demand-driven ICT training opportunities, match them with potential employers in the agriculture, industrialization, and ICT sectors, and create a whole new generation of globally competitive digital entrepreneurs, who in turn will become employers of labor. And that is why I've also taken the bold initiative to look into how the bank can support African countries to establish what we are calling youth entrepreneurship investment banks. These are going to be banks for young Africans, run by young Africans, top-notch, that provide long-term resources to help to unleash the business potential of our key demographic that has traditionally been shut out of opportunities and access to investment capital. The youth are not the future of Africa. They are the present of Africa. Africa must sharply focus and turn its demographic asset of its youthful population into economic assets. Issue number 4, diversity. Whether it's a nation, a state, business, organization, community, school, or religious places of worship, what we all have in common is our diversity. We live in a world of extraordinary beauty and biodiversity created by God. It is one of the reasons we all love to travel, isn't it? To places and enjoy experiences we've never done before, never had before. But the irony, however, is that sometimes we tend not to like or appreciate diversity. Instead, we discriminate based on differences in culture, or race, and color, and class, and gender, and religion, just to mention a few differences. So, despite our diversity, there is still a systemic tendency, in particular, to especially look down on women and lock women out of and consign them to limited roles and opportunities. Let me make 2 points on this. First is that diversity is important, but when diversity is mismanaged, not well optimized, diversity becomes divergence. And then it creates all kinds of problems for nations. The second is when it comes to women, let's recognize I've never seen any bird or any aircraft, any plane that flies on one wing. Likewise, societies and organizations and nations cannot fly successfully when women, who account for 50% of the population and are denied access, rights, and opportunities. A transformed Africa is only possible if the full potential of all men and women are leveraged for development. As such, we cannot talk about transformation without a serious critical rethink of how we lift millions of women from the bottom of the pyramid into prosperity. It is time to change. Under my leadership at the African Development Bank, we are working deliberately and very hard to increase the number of women employees of the bank. We're making excellent progress at staff and senior management levels, and we have a commitment to do even better in the years ahead. We are also committed irrevocably to gender mainstreaming all our investments as a bank. Today, you cannot get any project approved at the African Development Bank unless you can show how it benefits and empowers women. Indeed, 100% of all our projects are gender mapped, a global record for multilateral financial institutions. In conjunction with several development partners, we have set up what is called the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, called AFAWA, A-F-A-W-A initiative, to reduce an estimated $42 billion of access to finance gap facing women who run small and medium-sized enterprises on the continent compared to men, and to unleash women's entrepreneurial capacity. Ladies and gentlemen, African women are very entrepreneurial, but they are discriminated against by the financial systems in terms of access to finance. They are often asked for collaterals they do not have. Many financial institutions do not have processes and systems that are targeting women. Yet, women, when they have access to credit or finance, they pay back their loans. Indeed, 90% of women in Africa pay back on their loans. I don't know, maybe they remember 10% maybe from men who prevent them from paying back when they go and pay it back. Women are bankable. So I decided to lead the African Development Bank to tackle this challenge. And that's why the bank, AFAWA program, is launched to mobilize $5 billion to finance the businesses of women on the continent. Together with the excellent support and global advocacy by my dear friend, President Macron of France, he was able to help us to galvanize the G7 leaders, who provided over $450 million in financing to guarantee financial institutions that lend to women under this initiative. Today, the initiative has started working with banks and financial institutions in Africa to roll out access to finance for women at scale. Africa will achieve faster and more inclusive economic growth when it fully empowers its women. When women win, Africa wins. The fifth issue that I would like to talk about is creativity and innovation. One of the most challenging aspects of leadership is understanding what needs to change and when. History is replete with examples of once dominant innovators that were blindsided by change and eventually lost out to competitors. They include Kodak. You all will remember the Polaroid we used to have in those days, the Xerox machines, the Pan Am Airlines and General Motors, just to mention a few. They did not see change coming. They did not innovate. They did not anticipate. And today, they are gone. So in a dynamic global environment, leaders have a responsibility to recognize when change has outlived its purpose, and when what was once new and effective has become simply outdated and irrelevant. This requires creativity and innovation. As president of the African Development Bank Group, I've had the privilege of leading several innovative, groundbreaking initiatives, which will have a transformative impact by the grace of God across Africa. Now, let me briefly share with you 5 such examples where we are pushing the boundaries of what is possible and creating transformative change in the process. Special agro-industrial processing zones. We call them SAPZs. We must fully unlock the potential of Africa's agriculture. Over 65% of the remaining uncultivated arable land left in the world is not in Europe, it's not in Asia, it's not in Latin America. It is in Africa. What Africa therefore does with agriculture will determine the future of food in the world. Think of the potential. Africa's agro-industrial economy alone is expected to reach $1 trillion by 2030. It's just 9 years down the line. Africa has the potential, but nobody eats potential. So to help to reduce yield gaps between Africa and the rest of the world, to transform subsistence farming, produce food into more commercial farming, produce food at scale efficiently, to turn the continent into a global agricultural powerhouse, and to provide millions with employment opportunities across the agricultural value chains. The African Development Bank is now supporting the creation of what we call special agro-industrial processing zones. These will be zones located in rural areas to be fully enabled with integrated infrastructure, such as power, water, ICT, roads, and logistics, to support food agribusinesses to locate processing companies close to rural areas. These will allow Africa to not simply export raw materials, but value-added products. We will turn our cotton into textile and garments. We will turn our cocoa into chocolates. We will build first-class agricultural value chains that will allow Africa to become globally competitive. This will create vast economic opportunities for income and jobs all across Africa's decimated rural areas. It will give hope for lots of our people, tens of millions of them. It will reduce rural to urban migration. It will transform rural areas from zones of economic misery to new zones of economic prosperity. It will help to give hope all across our rural areas in Africa. Let me go to the other one I want to say on COVID-19, which we all are living in today, In 2020, the COVID-19 virus literally brought global economies to a standstill. Africa was hard hit. Before the pandemic, the continent was home to 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. But COVID-19 changed everything and reversed decades of development efforts. The GDP growth rate in Africa went down by 2.1%, which is the lowest we've had in 20 years. We had 30 million people fall into poverty. We lost 30 million jobs. The GDP per capita of Africa declined by between $145 to $190 billion. Fiscal deficits doubled. Debt ballooned because there wasn't money coming in. Millions of people have been infected with the virus, and sadly, many have died. Tourism, trade, business, education, sports and entertainment, and faith communities saw an unprecedented contraction in activity. Making matters worse was the fact that we now lag the rest of the world as Africa in terms of access to vaccines and the availability of health infrastructure. Recognizing the challenges of the moment and the many that lay ahead, the African Development Bank launched a $10 billion crisis response facility very quickly, with the goal of supporting countries to have resources to address some of these myriad fiscal challenges. The bank also responded fast by launching a $3 billion Fight COVID-19 social bond on the global capital markets to raise more resources. This was the largest ever US dollar denominated social bond ever in world history. The leadership of the African Development Bank is recognized globally. And in 2021, the African Development Bank was rated as the best multilateral financial institution in the world. Let me turn to climate change. Because COVID-19 is not Africa's only challenge. Even though Africa produces only 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, we bear the brunt of the devastating effects of climate change via floods and droughts and internal migration, conflict over limited resources, poverty, and unemployment. Along with several partners, we are doing several things at the bank now to mitigate the impact of climate change, including the introduction of heat-tolerant crops, insurance programs that enable African nations to rebuild after natural disasters, and initiatives designed to help our countries to adapt and build resilience to climate risks. We have boosted the share of our investment at the bank on climate change. We used to devote only 9% of our total lending resources to climate finance in 2016. That was just 1 year after I became president. Today, 40% of all of our finance is devoted to climate finance, with focus on climate adaptation. And as far as climate adaptation is concerned, the bank will help to mobilize $25 billion in support of climate adaptation in Africa. And myself and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the former United Nations Secretary General, just working together with the Global Center for Adaptation, just launched what's called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. That will mobilize $25 billion in support of adaptation. That will include, talking about close to 40 million farmers having access to digital climate advisory services, and creating probably about 1 million young Africans to have skills that help them to create green jobs. Today, the African Development Bank devotes 64% of all its climate finance to support climate adaptation in Africa, surpassing the United Nations Secretary General's call for 50% of the resources to be devoted to climate adaptation globally. The world is noticing our efforts. And just few weeks ago, the United Nations ranked the African Development Bank as the global leader among all multilateral finance institutions in terms of tackling climate adaptation globally. Let me give you another example. Desert to power. It's called desert to power. Despite the abundance of concentrated solar energy, the paradox is that Africa is energy poor. The lack of energy is a major impediment to economic and social development. In some countries, less than 5% of the population has access to power. As a bank, however, we have been at the forefront of innovative energy investments. As I mentioned to you, in our work with Light Up and Power Africa, which in the last 5 years has provided access to 30 million people to access to electricity. In Morocco, we co-financed the largest concentrated solar power station in the world. And today, we have taken a much bolder step. We've embarked on what is called Desert to Power, a $20 billion initiative. It will help to connect more than 250 million people to electricity by tapping into the region's abundant solar resources and provide about 10,000 megawatts of solar energy capacity. And that, many of the countries are in the Sahel, 11 countries, including even northern Nigeria, Ethiopia, and all that, in Sudan. This will make the Sahel of Africa alone the largest solar zone in the world. God gave us that, sunlight. We better use it. Let me also talk about Africa Investment Forum. A final and a brief example of innovative change is the Africa Investment Forum, which I had the honor of launching along with several other partners in 2018. We recognized that Africa needed to attract greater amounts of global capital to support accelerated development and overcome massive deficits in infrastructure investments. This unique investment forum has since become the premier investment marketplace for Africa. It attracted $78.1 billion of investment interest to Africa in 2018 and in 2019, and in both cases, in less than 72 hours. Nothing of that sort had ever happened before. In the rooms where presidents, investors, project owners, and public and private leaders come together, not to listen about talks about what was not working on the continent, but rather to take advantage of the unprecedented investment opportunities. And they did. I share each of these examples with you to say we must constantly scan our horizon for change and be ready long before it arrives. As leaders, we have a responsibility to be change agents and to constantly look for new and innovative ways of doing what is right more effectively and more efficiently, and to impact as many people as possible. Number 6 issue I want to talk about is faith. Ultimately, success is the product of truth, trust, and transparency, of passion, preparation, and persistence, of believability, brilliance, and boldness. But ultimately, for me as a leader, I know I cannot do anything without faith and having God helping me to get it done. It has been said that faith is the sun and the good works are the rays. Regardless of our spheres of influence, the works that we do have the capacity to make a difference. But in so doing, we must never seek to be the spotlight. Rather, selflessly, we must always seek to be the one who helps to shine light on the paths of others. Permit me, therefore, to share a passage of scripture with you from the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 32. It says, the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Within the context of this keynote, therefore, whatever good initiatives or works we do as leaders, may they be a reflection of our bold and audacious faith in God, who has called us in our generation to proclaim good news to millions of Africans afflicted by poverty, to bind up the brokenhearted, suffering from deprivations of bad governance, discrimination, abuse, and oppression, and to proclaim freedom to captive young men and women who have lost hope in themselves and in their future, and some, sadly, I must say, in their own countries. As a leader, you may go through the fiery furnace of trials, tribulation, and challenges. But remember that the only difference between charcoal and diamonds, which both have the same chemical composition, is that diamonds undergo much more intense heat and pressure, which in turn produces the precious and beautiful stone that the diamond becomes. My prayer today is that you will be resilient and shine like a diamond against great odds. May you be strong and carry out great exploits all your days to fulfill God's purpose, not only for yourself, but for the continent of Africa. May your works and faith make a difference for this and more generations to come. And may God bless Africa richly. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Wonderful.